Hello. Today we will be looking at our Chapter 1, Section 3 notes in our government textbook. So, Chapter 1, Section 3 begins on page 17 in our textbook, and you can access that textbook online, like I am today. Chapter 1, Section 3 is about the American people today. Who is it who lives in the United States today? Well, how do we know who lives in the US today? The census tells us who lives in the United States, or it can tell you who lives in other countries. So, what is a census? That word, census, is an official periodic counting of a population. So, when a country's government says we will go and count all of the people who live in a particular country, that's called a census. And the United States does a census every 10 years. There is a census in 2020. There is a census in 2030. There was a census back in 1900 and a census back in 1850. So every 10 years, when the year ends in a multiple of 10, we have a census in this country. It counts how many people live here, which is very important to know because government has to make decisions about how much to tax and where and how to spend money based on where people live. So the census tells the government that. The census is also important because it determines how many representatives a state has in our Congress. The more people you have, the more members of the United States House of Representatives a state would get. As the census has counted people in the United States over time, the number of Americans has steadily grown every year. Back in 1900, there were about 76 million Americans, and by 2000, there were almost 300 million Americans. And the census does not just count us, but it tells the government a lot about who is actually living in the United States. That's called demographics, the study of the characteristics of human populations. So the census asks questions about how old you are, and if you are a male or a female, or your race, or your income. So that information is all supposed to be private, that the individual isn't known to the government by that. But overall, the census should tell the government that there are this many people who are over the age of 80 or under the age of 10 who live in your country. So the text then discusses how, over time, the US population has grown. Every census we have ever had, the US population has increased. Well, how does that happen? The textbook then moves on to talking about natural increase in population. That means that our birth rate is higher than our death rate, that more babies are born than people die every year. And so if you have more people being born than you have people dying, then your population will grow. And that the United States' birth rate has been higher than our death rate every year that we have ever had a census, and every year in American history since we were created. But besides natural increase in population, the United States has added territory over time. That we started off as just the 13 colonies on the east coast of the United States, but that throughout the 1800s, we gained huge sections of territory in a war with Mexico and took Texas and California. We bought Alaska from Russia. So we added lots of territory, and that increased our population. And then the third thing that increased our population was immigration, peoples from other countries moving to the United States. So since 1820, over 60 million immigrants from all over the world have come to the United States. So those three ways, natural increase in population, more births than deaths, adding territory, and immigration, have increased America's overall population every year. Our population is not only growing, but it is changing. Who are those people that live in the United States? Who are our fellow American citizens and residents? So the text talks about how households have changed, divorce rates have increased dramatically in the last 40 or 50 years. And so that means there are many more one parent households, many headed by women than there ever used to be. Women's roles have changed dramatically over time, and far more women are in the paid workforce with careers than they used to be in this country. And the American population is also getting significantly older. So people who are 100 years old or older are called centenarians, and there were over 70,000 centenarians in the 2010 census. So people are living much longer, and it means that our overall population is also getting much older. And then lastly, the people who live here are also becoming much more diverse. So early census forms basically said you pick your race and ethnic background as well, and we have asked those questions on U.S. censuses forever, and they are becoming more and more varied as more people from all over the world come to the United States. Now, of the people who live here in the U.S., there has also been much change. And so the last part of Chapter 1, Section 3 talks about a population on the move. And so when the United States was first created, we were mostly a nation of farmers, the textbook says. There were some cities, but most Americans lived on farms. So throughout the 1800s, that started to change. There was migration. Migration means a movement of large numbers of people from one region to another, or from a region to a city. And so there was lots of migration throughout the 1800s from rural areas or farm areas to urban areas or to city areas. So that started to change almost 200 years ago, that America became much more urban and much less rural. Then by the 1900s, there were also suburbs being created. So towns that were outside of cities, in a lot of ways, like Collinsville and Fairmont City and Caseyville and Maryville and State Park, the suburbs that make up the Unit 10 school district. Suburbs were smaller cities that sort of were near big, large cities, but they were also not out in the country and farm areas either. And so we had the growth of suburbs starting in the 1900s and getting much faster growth in suburbs after World War II. So in the 1950s, suburbs gained lots of population. And then Americans were not just migrating from rural areas to cities, but we were also migrating in this country from northern areas and eastern areas to western areas and southern areas. That's called the Sun Belt. That many Americans chose to live in warmer places, and with the automobile and suburbs and highways, it became much easier for Americans to start traveling throughout the country and migrating and moving. And we have seen many Americans leave colder climates in the north and east and head to places, especially like Florida and Southern California and even North Carolina, as more and more people have been moving to the Sun Belt. So that concludes our Chapter 1, Section 3 notes. Make sure you go back and read those pages, Chapter 1, Section 3. And if you have any questions, be prepared to ask when we discuss this part of Chapter 1. Thanks for your attention.